It's 12 o'clock.
Can people hear me? Can you give me indication whether I can be heard? So I might make a start now if it's... The start I want to make is to talk about sustainable cities. How are we going there, Matt? Is things happening? Is it working? So I can start and you're happy?
Well, if you could start the STSN Hangout feed, we don't have that yet.
You don't have that yet?
Broadcast.
Okay, it looks like it's on for me, so...
Okay, we'll refresh our feed.
What it's showing is the infinite regress. Yeah.
Okay. Give me 1 moment.
Okay.
Okay, we have you.
Okay, good. So do you have, if I go to PowerPoint now, you have that?
Yeah, we have your PowerPoint up right now.
Okay, great.
And yeah, so go ahead and begin whenever you're ready.
Okay. I have to find it myself now. So what I'm talking about today is sustainable cities. And the whole issue of sustainable cities is completely vexatious. It's complicated. The issues are so complicated partly because what they do is they cross the world in different ways. So on the screen at the moment, you have a PowerPoint which shows two very different kinds of cities. One is Ulaanbaatar, which is the PowerPoint picture to the right, and the other one is San Francisco. And the kinds of issues that they face are completely different. And yet, at the same time, what I want to talk about tonight is the complicated way in which even cities as different as Ulaanbaatar and San Francisco, cities as different as Port Moresby and Johannesburg and Melbourne and Berlin, all face very similar issues. They face issues which entail a mixture of unique problems and then a global series of issues which we need to take account of. And in effect, the framing of this particular discussion that we have tonight is framed by what I'm calling the crises of an urbanizing planet. And these crises are quite profound. They're things that we've talked about before. They're things that you've heard about many times. One of the things which came up in the questions was the whole one around sprawl. Colonization of agricultural land is only one example of the sprawl question. Sprawl is having a major effect. It's not just in cities that you expect. It's not just in North American cities, particularly the cities of Arizona, like Phoenix and so on, but it's also occurring in cities in Australia, in Latin America, and in Asia. And so what we're seeing with these cities, they're getting bigger and broader, and there's a process of suburbanization going on. Now, one of the people who was interested in this talk asked me about the allocation of more land for agriculture. How can you maintain that land when you're seeing a colonization of agriculture across the world? Well, one of the possibilities is by urban growth boundaries, that is setting restrictions on these sprawl, and that entails government legislation. There's also ways of doing zoning. You can use taxation on unused land. You can also use reassessments of different land use, including the use of urban agriculture. Now, that's the first one. The second big and major issue is bloat. And again, there was a whole series of questions that were asked around the resource use question. We're using increasing resources, and how can cities allow us to respond to those cities, to respond to those problems, and to reduce the ways in which resources are used? And the kinds of answers that we take up there include things like density and better planning around transport modes, moving towards thinking about how water and things like the basic resources, and water I think is probably the best example of one of the most basic resources on the planet, thinking about how they can be used more sustainably, but thinking about it through both the education side but also the political side of putting restrictions on some uses for water. The next big one, and it's massive, it's the inequity issue on the planet. Lots of writers around the world, and the most famous one at the moment is the book called Capital, which has been circulating, not the book Capital by Karl Marx, but the book Capital by Thomas Piketty. And what it's been doing is saying inequity is increasing in this world, and it's increasing even during times of downturn. Even during global financial crises and through depressions and recessions, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And that kind of split that's occurring is one of the basic issues, which, including the movement to cities, the urbanization issue, is leading to increasing slums in our world. Now, a lot is being done, and UN Habitat has made big claims about the ways in which many things are changing, and cities doing a lot to respond to the issues of slums. It's true. But at the same time, while all those big things are happening through urban redevelopment, renewal, slum reclamation, and so on, there are still some pretty basic issues. And even while that's happening, slums are increasing. The next one is financial instability. We know about the financial global crisis, but it's having a major effect which goes all the way down to grassroots issues which surround cities. And this has an effect upon how much they can spend. Deficient infrastructure is connected to that spending question. In places like India, they are spending millions and millions, billions of dollars on new infrastructure, particularly on things in cities like crossovers, passovers, and freeways to try and stop congestion of traffic. And it really doesn't do what should be done for the amount of money that's being spent on this massive infrastructure. And then the big one, which is all everybody's been talking about, is climate change. The issue of basic shifts in the Earth's climate, which are going to lead, if we get towards 2 degrees by the end of the century, although some predictions are now making 4 degrees, it'll lead us into a world in which we live in a complicated series of storm crises, inundation through surges, rising sea levels, heating issues which lead to fire, massive problems which will all have a big impact on the nature of cities. And finally, and I've only picked out 7 issues here, I picked out a few of the main ones: cultural malaise, including crisis of meaning. And what's happening with this, I think very importantly, is that we're seeing, on the one hand, a return to more fundamentalism, and on the other hand, we're seeing a kind of hedonistic consumption, which is a compensatory consumption, where people are finding meaning through objects, meaning through commodities. Now, that's a big list of things, and cities are right at the center of that maelstrom, the crises of the urbanizing planet. In that process, what I want to talk about today is, firstly, I want to go through some paradoxes about sustainable cities. I want to move us through a couple of those paradoxes to see how complicated sustainability is. And then I want to move on to talk about how we might respond to it and what kinds of issues that it takes. There is one model which has been put forward, the triple bottom line, which is to try and think about the ways in which sustainability can be connected to sustainable economies and so on. I'll talk a bit about that. And then I'm going to try and do a bit more. I'm going to try and do a bit more that actually sets a framework for moving us towards a clearer understanding of the kinds of frameworks we would need to actually respond to the complexity of the world as we're currently talking about it. So firstly, to these paradoxes of sustainability. The first one is, the more the language of sustainability is used, the more it seems to be directed at rationalizing unsustainable development. That is, the phrase sustainability is used for everything that we now do. The phrase sustainability is one of those very crucial words. It's a word that we should be using, we should be thinking about very closely and attentively. But the issues that we're seeing in relation to that is, unfortunately, that every issue that goes ahead. So I take you to my city, Melbourne, where I'm currently broadcasting from. We did a huge process of setting up what was called a sustainable water reproduction device. So it's a big desalination plant. It's the biggest desalination plant in the Southern Hemisphere. It's costing about $56 billion. And it's put together under the guise of sustainability. And yet it is completely environmentally unsustainable. It's ecologically damaging. It produces enormous amounts of salt, but it also costs enormous energy to run. And so far it's been in place, running for months and entering into years now. And we haven't actually used any of that water because there's been enough rain to actually sustain our water needs through natural means. So that kinds of things, the use of the word sustainability for times when we in fact are doing sustainable or unsustainable work. The second paradox I want to draw your attention to is that cities are really the heart of the problem about unsustainability. For all the discussion about agriculture or burning trees or tundra and carbon emissions from old systems of the environment, the biggest problem is actually resource use in cities. And despite that, cities are now the basis of the answer. By living in cities and living in a different way in cities with more resource care, with more resource density, with use of transport in a different way, cities will actually become the possible renewal of our response to how we've got sustainability problems. So what I'm talking about there is what I'm going to call positive sustainability. Positive sustainability is quite a difficult concept, and we'll get to that in a minute. The next one's quite strange. In fact, the more we work towards singular solutions to things, the more we work towards saying this is the answer, things like inclusion is the answer, or meeting the needs of the population is the answer, the more the problems arise, the more the complex the world becomes. And I've just put 3 things up on the screen there. The first one is needs versus limits. The second one is inclusion versus exclusion. And the third one is participation versus authority. Now, there's a tendency in the literature to say that the first of those lists, that is needs, is the most important thing, that inclusion is the most important thing, and participation is the most important thing. And we have lots of people who are using those words as indicators of what is the good. But the issue becomes, in relation to, say, needs, that limits are also crucial, and it's negotiation between needs and limits that are foundational to thinking about what is a good city. And we're talking about the question of inclusion, and inclusion is the language used by many NGOs, it's used by international organizations, cities have it in their policies, and even nation states are using the word inclusion. But in fact, to have good inclusion, you have to have exclusion. Exclusion includes boundaries, it includes restrictions on land use. It means, for example, when there's a flood-prone area, that a zone is set up to stop people building there. It means things as simple as the exclusion of men from situations occasionally where women who are Muslim want to swim on a Wednesday afternoon. And to exclude men on a Wednesday afternoon is to include women who are who don't feel capable of swimming at the same time as men there in the same time. So what you have in that kind of world is a negotiation on very simple and complex things of inclusion and exclusion. Inclusion is not the answer, but rather complicated negotiation between those two things are. So here we are, participation and authority. Participation is seen as a very good thing, and yet without the authority to participate and without structures which allow good participation, we find ourselves unable to actually bring about participation except in a fairly meaningless way, or participation which is very meaningful but momentary and then leads to, say, the participation of voting for mayors, which then leads to people feeling like they've taken part for a short time, and then the politics returns to a fairly mundane life of other people making decisions for us. The final one I want to draw attention to is the more that this is a paradox upon a paradox, if you like, the more that we recognize the complexity of those contradictory pressures, the more we tend to use it as an excuse for doing nothing. And what's clear and what's very important in the world of sustainable cities is we have to do things. Planning, which has often caused some of the greatest problems in cities, bad planning that is, we have to be much more cognizant now of what good planning might entail and the ways in which we might achieve it. Now, that entails us then going towards talking about what is sustainability. Let me just now define these terms. In our common future, that's the Brundtland report, the report that's now one of the most famous and important definers of sustainable development. Sustainable development is defined as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generation to meet their own needs. And it's a crucial and important definition that still holds. But the word needs is the key to actually making that into a good definition, and it's left undefined. And remember I talked before about the relationship between needs and limits. What we need to do actually is negotiate what those needs are. We can't leave them as simply open needs which people define for themselves. They need to work with others in looking at their needs, thinking about what those needs are, and we work through them together to define the limits of our needs in relation to others' needs. And that's a complicated process, but one that needs to happen. In the definition that I have up on the screen, development is defined as social change with all its intended or unintended consequences, good and bad, that brings about a significant and pattern shift in the technologies, techniques, infrastructure, and or associated life forms of a place or a people. That sounds a bit complicated, but what it's saying is development is a kind of change that brings about pattern shifts. Now, that doesn't mean that development is good. It actually means that development could be completely bad. And what, again, we return to the same issue. We have to define what is good development and what is bad development rather than just assuming that development is good. And this also relates to things like growth. There's a tendency in our world today to say that growth is a good thing. But in fact, growth is part of the problem of the expansion of needs beyond the limits of this planet. And in places like New York, London, Melbourne, Berlin, we are living beyond our means. And in places even as so-called efficient and sustainable as New York, we're living on more than 2.5 planets. And therefore, even our very lives today need to be restricted within a kind of idea about development which cannot have the changes and involvements that other than to define them as good. And then finally, I want to define positive sustainability. And the word positive here is quite important. Sustainability just means enduring, but you can have bad enduring things. And at the moment, we have bad excessive growth, and we have over-resource use, and we have a planet that if we don't change, will by the end of the century be unfit for human habitation. That's the predictions that have been made by about 98% of the world's scientists at the moment. If between 2 and 4 degrees climate change occur, our cities will be relatively unlivable. So that means that positive sustainability, and I've defined it here on the screen, as practices and meanings of human engagement that make for life worlds that project the ongoing probability of natural and social flourishing, vibrancy, resilience, and adaptation. And the key word there is flourishing. It means that, for example, instead of growth, economic growth being a key, economic prosperity should be a key. Instead of simply proliferating culture, it becomes that cultural vitality is the key, and so on and so on. So let me move to the next stage of my argument and the kinds of things I want to talk about. This is the dominant form, the triple bottom line. And the triple bottom line sets it up as a framework where the economy is either the center of what we do, or it's treated as so important that it's the key dimension where environment is an externality and the big things of the social are put into the extra bag of possibilities. What I want to do is change that around completely and argue for something very different. At the moment, in that triple bottom line approach, sustainability is the small area that sits in the core at the middle of that Venn diagram. It's the area which meets the connection between economy, environment, and social. And what I want to suggest is sustainability cannot be contained in that way. It cannot be part of that little tiny center of the Venn diagram. And what I want to set up is an argument around cities having to attend to the circles of social life. And that means that we take economy very seriously, we take ecology seriously, and we also take politics and culture seriously. And what you can see in the diagram that's in the paper and on screen, you can see a diagram that shows you a picture of a world where these things are bound up with each other. Instead of being separate things, separate domains, you can actually talk about the culture of economics and the ecology of economics, the politics of economics. No longer is it the case that economics sits off by itself in a separate domain, sometimes coming into intersection with the others. It's always in intersection with the others, and this is the key point, it is already a social domain. It is already a domain that has to be brought in to contention, and we have to think about these things. Now, what's been done there is we've set up a domain model and then some subdomains within it, and then we've made a judgment about the vibrancy or otherwise of either of these subdomains. And that's a city representation there. It's the city of Melbourne from which I come. And what you see on the screen is the city of Melbourne, while economically rich, vibrant, prosperous, with relative equality, although it's an increasing equality in this city with 20,000 homeless people now walking the streets, and with vibrant culture, an amazing city, a city with a very good, stable but vibrant politics, a city which has been, for the last 3 years, under the Economist scale, being set as the most livable city in the world. This most livable city in the world is completely unsustainable. And you can see that from the form, that these subdomains of air and water and resources, particularly the two ones at the top, are completely unsustainable. And what we're seeing are problems that will mean that Melbourne will be part of the problem if it continues on with the same kinds of resource use and the same kinds of ways of managing air and water. Now let's move to how that's set up. It's set up as 4 domains. And by setting up these 4 domains, what it allows you to do is make claims about those 4 domains. With the triple bottom line notion, nobody says what the economy should be. Now I'm going to make a claim about the ecology. Social life should have a deeper and more integrated relationship with nature. Economics. Social life should be based around an economy organized around negotiated social needs rather than growth. Politics. Social life should have an enhanced emphasis on engaged and negotiated civic involvement. And finally, culture. Social life should actively develop ongoing processes for dealing with the uncomfortable intersections of identity and difference. So what I've done there, and you might have different ways of expressing these are simply mine. They've been tested with many other people, but they've come from, even if they've been negotiated and discussed, they're simply from a group of us who've made some claims about what this particular world should be. And in doing so, we make no pretension that they may not be yours, but we do make the claim that unless you have claims about ecology, economics, politics, and culture, and all those complexities that go with it, then the world that you build will not be a sustainable one. So let's go to these domains of the social. Remember I said there are 4 domains: economics, ecology, politics, and culture. So how do we set up a framework which allows us to say what a good city might look like? Well, firstly, we've got to know what economics is. And what we've defined economics as is a number of subdomains. Economics is much more than finance. Economics is much more than just how well the American dollar is doing, or the Australian dollar, or the Bolivian dollar. It's much more than financial transactions and wealth. It's production and resourcing, it's exchange and transfer, but it's also accounting and regulation, it's consumption and use, it's labour and welfare. Labour and welfare are often left out of economic considerations or seen as very secondary, but unemployment is a major issue, including in the centres of Europe at the moment, around youth unemployment. And the major cities of Europe, from Greece, what we're seeing is youth unemployment at upwards of 20%, sometimes going on to 40%. Incredible levels of youth unemployment which need to be attended to. And then technology, infrastructure, and wealth and distribution. In ecology, we have a similar set of domains, and they include not just materials and energy, water and air, but also things like the built environment and transport, or embodiment and sustenance and emissions and waste. And then there are a series of political domains. The politics is not just about government. Politics is about many things, including law and justice and reconciliation, things which you don't necessarily think of automatically under politics. But for a city to be sustainable, it has to attend to all of those things. And then culture. Culture is not just movies, films, and high culture. It's also identity. It's also creativity. It's memory, it's belief, it's gender and generations. It's questions of well-being and also about learning. Now, when you do that, you can set up a scale which can make some judgments about what that city will look like on all of those subdomains. And we can move through that and we can ask some questions. And then we get a model like I've just displayed on the screen, which shows the city of Melbourne. Now, these are the sort of questions that I'm talking about. When you go into one of the domains, let's take the ecology domain as an example, and you want to ask about an issue which is fundamental across the world, whether it's talked about for India and the work that some of the writers that you would have read for this seminar today have been writing about. Water is one of the crucial resources of our time. And what is it about water that we need to attend to? It's not just whether water is clean or not. It's many, many things. And those 7 questions there are intended to get at the questions that surround water. And we can go deeper, of course. The bodies of water in the urban region, ready access to potable water, the presence of clean, quality air and water in the urban region. And we go on to look at other things as well. So the questions are then, and we move around the circle and we answer questions in relation to that, including questions about health, which is about health and well-being. And then you can make a claim about a particular city. Now, interestingly, this is the city of Delhi that I'm showing here. And the city of Delhi has one of the worst air and water problems. It has highly polluted water. Compared to the city of Melbourne, it's actually got very dirty water. And yet, why the judgment here that actually this is actually more sustainable than Melbourne is because we're not just looking at the immediate inside the city. Melbourne is a green, leafy city with relatively clean water and potable water for all. But to use the example that I used before, it is producing its water in an unsustainable means that uses an enormous amount of electricity, unrenewable electricity. And we go to the resources issue. It's a massively consuming city, which is using resources both through commodity consumption, but also through electricity production. And its electricity is one of the most unsustainable in the world, which is done through brown coal. Now, Melbourne could change, and it slowly is changing. It's a city with great capacity to change. It is a great city to live in, and I love it. But it's not a city which currently can be proud of the way in which it's handling its ecological problems. Delhi cannot be proud either, but it has, because of its great inequities of wealth and because people aren't using as many resources, it is a city which still is relatively sustainable. Here's Hyderabad, here is Johannesburg. Johannesburg, interestingly, if we did in this survey and looked at it 20 or 30 years ago, politically would have been disastrous because of the laws and justice questions, the governance issues around apartheid. And yet politically is now a very strong city, and it's using these issues, the strength of its politics, to actually bring about a change in the way in which the other domains are working. And so we can do comparative analysis of different cities. Now, I want to bring you back now to the question of social themes, these negotiable social themes, and take you to the question of well-being and adversity, accumulation and distribution. Well-being and adversity is one of those very interesting ones. Everybody wants well-being, and yet when we need to negotiate these things, we're going to be facing adversity which is mixed and uneven across the planet. And in effect, what we're saying by bringing these two things into contention, cities across the world are going to have to share the terms of adversity and the terms of well-being with each other. And inside a city itself, if you simply go for well-being, you're going to get a city like Melbourne, which then will cause problems for the rest of the world. If we go to the accumulation and distribution problem, what we're seeing is increasing accumulation of wealth in this world, and at the same time, a lack of distribution to the world's poor and problems associated with inequities of wealth and poverty across the world. There are cities like Rio in Brazil, which has huge slums, massive problems of inequity, and while it's trying to do important things about those change, the world has to move much more fast to change that in the way in which it's operating. So it sets up these things just to say, we have to do these, and these negotiations that are occurring in cities are very important things. So how do we do it? Here's the turn that I want to take you through for the last 10 minutes of the talk, and then try and conclude. How do we do it? We start by a commitment to thinking through the kinds of issues that we have. And that commitment will then lead to an assessment. An assessment is a very complicated thing, but it's something which you can do by looking at the various domains of social life. An assessment entails going into the detail of each city. I've set up a framework for doing big global protocols, but inside each city are very particular things where the assessment has to be about what is happening in that place. Then we move to the definition of that terms. Now, to define the terms, and I'll take you through one example from Johannesburg. Johannesburg has a mixed great inequity issue, which is a carryover from the old apartheid days. And Johannesburg is trying to deal with this, and was trying to do it through a bus transit system, a rapid bus transit system, which moved from Soweto in the south to up to Sandton in the north, where it's the new CBD. The central CBD has really been bypassed and has become not a dead centre, but a second centre with declining prosperity. And it tried to set up a rapid transit system to connect the north to the south, to bring people from the south, particularly up to the north, for jobs. But what it forgot to do was to think about the cultural dimensions of that. Economically, it managed the process very well, particularly the infrastructural development side of the economics, where it put in the best infrastructure you could possibly have. Extraordinarily good buses. It put in a system of zones and bus stops, which were the highest standard you could possibly develop. It put in ecologically a wonderful set of background support structures, which meant that these buses were the best quality buses you had for diesel emissions. It meant that these buses were planned around fuels which were minimally carbon emitting. It does all its own oil changes, the oil is reclaimed, all those sort of things were done well. But what it forgot was the political governance question, and it forgot about the cultural questions. The people of the south, Soweto, didn't recognize it as a kind of bus system they could use for themselves. They didn't recognize it in the underutilization of it. At the same time, a freeway was put in from the north to the south, and people felt free free to move along this freeway in their cars and to use the old small buses that were available and very unsustainable both economically and environmentally. And because they hadn't done the cultural work to actually say, we're bringing about a change in the city which is positively cultural, and politically we're doing it which is connected to you. So by negotiation, by consultation, they're starting to turn that around, and now they're calling this bus system a corridor of freedom, and they're trying to show the people of Soweto that it can be useful for them, it's cheaper for them, and it's better for them in many ways to actually connect to the rest of the city. But then you move on and you implement projects in a way that reverse and define and move along, and then you measure your outcomes and then you communicate. And that goes around in an ever increasing spiral, because we entered into the process of working in Johannesburg at the process after they'd done the implementation. We came back to do a redefinition stage, and what we found was we needed more work, and that more work is happening. The same thing in projects that we've been working on in Porto Alegre, which I'll come to in a moment. So this model unfolds. You can see it there. It unfolds in ways that you can put tools against it, and it sets you a framework for moving through and learning about what we do. I'm going to use one more example, and it's an example from the other side of the world in Latin America. It's from Porto Alegre, Residencia Chocolatao, which was a slum. It was a slum which was in the middle of Chocolatao, and it was a slum which 1,000 people lived in degraded circumstances in a way that was very complicated. They lived in a way that they recycled rubbish. They brought the rubbish back to their own homes. They recycled the rubbish in their lounge room. Their children got sick because of the bacteria in the rubbish. Some of the rubbish spontaneously combusted because of heating problems. As you compost rubbish, it heats up and causes fires. People got killed in those fires. The children didn't go to school because often they had to walk the streets with their parents to collect rubbish. The city of Porto Alegre, using that model which says culture, politics, ecology, and economics are all important, started to think about how they would reclaim that slum. And normally you would not want to move a slum, people. Normally you want to reclaim a slum from within by adding to a slum's facilities, by increasing its potable water, by doing lots of things which make a difference to that slum. But this time the city decided that it needed to move these people, and it moved them to the place that we now see. But instead of just putting them into high-rise apartments on the outskirts of town, and what normally happens when you bulldoze a slum and put people into high-rise apartments is they sell their apartments, they leave that place, and they come back to the center of the city and create new slums because that's where their livelihoods are. So let's take economics very seriously in this case, because their livelihoods are around the recycling of rubbish. And by recycling of rubbish, they made their money. Now, the way in which this was changed, and it was a stroke of genius by the city of Porto Alegre. They said, instead of these people going to collect their own rubbish, taking it out of the rubbish bins, disrupting the rubbish system, why not set it up so that they go to a rubbish depot and we bring the rubbish to them? And so rubbish depots were set up just outside of the new Chocolatao, Residencia Chocolatao, but also in all of the slums, recycling depots were set up. They made it illegal to go and collect rubbish and to bring it through the streets through the wheel carts that previously been used. And they set it up in such a way as that people could start to recycle rubbish and sell it on, not to the middlemen and the middle people who were making a lot of money out of this, but sell it directly into the recycling industry. Their increase in wages was 4 to 5-fold. Their time consumption for this process meant they were probably doing 2/3 of the number of hours for a 5-fold increase in income. But the children were no longer going to work on the street, and the children now went to school. The children no longer were getting sick. And so what we had there, now I don't want to paint a picture of a perfect project because it was far from perfect. There were lots of problems, particularly with the drug cartels. As it eventuated, the drug cartels tried to move back into the Residencia Chocolatao and tried to take over, so there were problems with violence. There were also problems as people have decided to move on. They've become now part of the working class and relatively stable, and now have started to move on, and there's been changing populations in the community. And so things have become very different in residential Chocolatao. But it is a place where people are now setting up their own small shops, they're setting up their own sustainable livelihoods, and people are being supported. The old man who's in the picture is a person who was part of the old Chocolatao. He couldn't get into his home very readily. He had to be lifted into his home. And now by simple mechanisms like putting in ramps and by putting in rails, he is part of the political group, which is now a self-managing political council for this small community of Chocolatao of about 1,000 people. And he's a highly respected elder. Now, let me try and summarize what I've been doing. Over the last 35, 40 minutes, what I've been doing is setting up the conditions of saying our cities are in crisis. And yet they are part of the solution to a much bigger crisis which is affecting our planet. Cities are in crisis, but cities are the places where extraordinary, vibrant things are happening around the world. Whether we're talking about Berlin or San Francisco or Ulaanbaatar or Porto Alegre or Melbourne or Curitiba or Paris, what we're seeing is cities that are making a difference. Johannesburg is working on a series of projects which are making a big difference to its city. In some ways, cities are doing more radical things than the nation states are capable of doing. The nation states are going to very big forums. They're going to talking about Kyoto and post-Kyoto protocols around climate change. The cities are now thinking about the ways in which they can enact climate change adaptation and mitigation policies and proposals. They're putting projects on the ground and making things happen. So it's not bleak. There are things happening in Indian cities which are making major change at the moment. The difficulties are immense. The numbers of people, the population changes are incredible. But there are people who are working in small NGOs and in large international organizations across places like India, Brazil, and China, where it's not just the state that's operating, it's also other people. It's local communities that are making a big difference to that. And what I've tried to emphasize is if you just focus on economics, or even if you just focus on economics in relation to ecology, you miss out on foundational things. And for me, you need to bring in, and this is probably the biggest message of what I've been trying to argue, you need to bring in culture and you need to bring in politics. Because without culture and politics in relationship to economics and ecology, what we find ourselves with mega projects or even with small projects, and mostly they fail. They fail not because the ideals aren't good, but because we haven't actually thought through the complexity and the comprehensiveness of how we need to do it. And I've used the word complexity a lot during this talk, but it's not that the world is so complex that we can't do things about it. Rather, if we break it down into its parts, we work out what we think is the good, we work on what I've called positive sustainability, and each city decides for itself what it thinks are its most important projects. It assesses, defines, and then implements those projects. Cities will make the world a more sustainable place. So I'll stop the formal part of the talk there and open it up for discussion and see if we can get some discussion which enables us to take it further. So what we're looking for now are questions that you want to ask me, and I'll respond to those questions as they come up. Now, all I have to do is find out where those questions are. If I could have some help with that, that would be great, Matt. So there's a question here from Carlos who says, how to build sustainable cities in low-income countries, as these countries have to solve other problems such as poverty, hunger, justice, chronic diseases, which may be exacerbated in the context of climate change. Well, what I've been talking about, I talked about in relation to Porto Alegre. Porto Alegre is it's a post-industrial poor city. It's not a rich city, but when I've been talking about sustainability, I don't just mean ecological sustainability. good ecological sustainability relies upon doing economics differently. And so to deal with these kinds of issues. Who says how to build sustainable cities in low-income countries. So what I'm talking about here is that when you're dealing with poverty, hunger, justice, or chronic diseases, you're actually making cities more sustainable places to live. An example, if you take the chronic diseases issue, at the moment, chronic diseases, particularly in Southeast Asia and parts of Latin America and Africa, those chronic diseases are usually through infrastructure problems. Sewerage was one of the big changes to Europe, North America, and to places like Australia in the late 19th century and early parts of the 20th century, which brought about the biggest changes to chronic diseases. So what we need to be doing is working on those base level infrastructure, not necessarily focusing, as we tending to do at the moment, on simply transport infrastructure, which has become the key spending dimension of our cities. Now, if we go to some other questions there, I'm just looking down. There's a question from Paulita. There's a rapid population in cities at the moment, and these ideals of self-sufficiency and micro-development activity. But how do world leaders look at approaching a shift in culture, in this case of sustainable cities, a shift from great consumerist and marketed sociologies to more efficient and aware society? It's happening. One of the things which I think a city can do, and I think where I started off by talking about the colonization of agricultural land, we're now seeing food insecurity across many cities. Even in cities where the wealthy are able to afford food very comfortably, food is becoming much more expensive. And what cities can do under those circumstances is actually bring farmers' markets into the middle of cities and urban agriculture into the middle of cities. And it's not just for the poor, it's also for the wealthy. It becomes for everybody, and therefore becomes something that everybody can support. Fresh, good, sustainable food readily available for people. And by then bringing farmers' markets into the center of city, you're also supporting farmers at the same time. And so in answer to that question, one of the things about consumption that needs to be handled, and I think self-sustainability is a key dimension, is to think about seasonally relevant food and to have education programs which talk about the ways in which food could be much more sustainable. Chrome tab on the upper left-hand corner. Don't know how to do that, sorry. What it says on my machine is I'm still loading, and so that the loading issue is probably part of the problem. So can you hear me at the moment? Am I still? There are two tabs open, okay. So if I get rid of that tab, and it's good that I'm broadcasting. What I'm looking for are other questions that I can respond to, but I can actually take up questions that other people have asked. One of the questions asked about one of the readings was that they said that there was wonderful suggestions for finding an approach that combines top-down and bottom-up methods. It's always been the holy grail of sustainability analysis to get top-down protocols mixed with community engagement from the bottom up. But in fact, it's not so hard. And one of the issues that currently exists in the world today is the problem that we put indicators in before we think about what the problems are in our particular cities. The method that I've just given to you starts with setting up an argument about what are the critical issues in your city, and it asks you to look at the dimensions, the domains, politics, culture, economics and ecology, and move around those domains and subdomains and say, what are the critical issues for your city? And then it asks you to set up the problems associated with that. Now, in doing so, you've set a global protocol for doing something. You've set it as a framework which people can follow. But you're also then taking it out to the community to ask them, what do they think the critical issues are? One of the prime examples of this methodology is participatory budgeting, where you go to a community having set a general global protocol around how much of your budget you're going to spend, and you go to the community to say, within this budget parameter, how will we spend this amount of money? And you have a long and careful process adjudicated by experts who can then bring it into engineering focus or into educational focus or other forms of expert knowledge to make sure that it actually has a means of doing it. Now, another question. Large existing cities have complex problems and challenges. Is transformation to a sustainable city possible in Mexico City, Bogota, Sao Paulo, for example? Well, absolutely. Now, Bogota, all those cities are actually, now you've chosen Latin American cities. All of those cities are profoundly attentive to those issues at the moment. Mexico City is a very good example of a city which is starting to use bus rapid transit systems. So instead of putting in big freeways, instead of just putting in a whole series of new avenues for cars to ride in, it's taken the example of Curitiba and other cities around the world. And there's many cities around the world. I mentioned Johannesburg is now using bus rapid transit system, but so is Ahmedabad in India. And it's using that as a mechanism for remaking its city. Bogota is a city which has had enormous problems in the past, particularly around violence to do with the drug trade and the cartels. And yet Bogota has been remaking itself. A series of mayors in Bogota have been remaking the sustainability of their cities in quite remarkable ways by working from the grassroots, by themselves walking out into the traffic with strange bodysuits on and working with local school children to say the safety of our children means that you as a city of drivers needs to slow down, that you as a city of drivers needs to think about the resource use. And in Sao Paulo has been developing a whole series of new developments. It has a new regional plan for the development of Sao Paulo, which recognizes, despite the massiveness of this city, that there are other mechanisms that we can actually use to develop that. And they've been using the same tripartite model to think, how can we not just do infrastructure, but we can also do other things. So to go through and to find some more examples, from Diane. To promote a sustainable city, the public sector is fundamental, but how does it work with people, the main actor of change? The government is temporary and the ideas change all the time. Now, I think one of the great principles is that unless you bring the government into this process, then those big sustainability projects, or even the small ones, tend to have major problems around legislative framing, around financial and resourcing, and you can bring them in many ways. Governments at the moment and at the city level are very keen to work with communities, and for all the limitations, the way of doing it is to actually bring the city in, bring the municipality in by enacting from the civil society level a relationship to that city, by actually asking that city, we need change in this respect. Now, to use Bogota or another city, I'll use Medellin as an example, which is another city in Colombo. Medellin has a series of grassroots movements which has invited the city officials to help them with. So, for example, it tried to set up Sundays for free movement of bicycles, runners, joggers, walkers, and that meant the city had to negotiate the closing down of many of its roads on that Sunday. Without bringing the city and its municipals in to legislate for that closing down, then you couldn't do it. And so by a mixture of civic relations and by having people talk about it, that meant that the city brought those things in. Adriana asks, she says, it is clear that sustainable cities and new projects for resilience construction need institution and joints between public and private sectors. How to achieve this in slums where the absence of government becomes evident? Well, there are institutions that are actually specializing in this. In a place like Chile, there is a group called Techo, and Techo means roof over our heads. It currently is running right across Latin America and includes 100,000 youth, mainly university students, and they are mediating between the slums and the governments, and using government money, they are getting resources to help people help themselves rebuild their own slums. But there are other international organizations like UN Habitat, which I think is one of the most crucial in slum reclamation today, where UN Habitat is working with governments and other agencies to make a difference in those places. So to achieve this in slums, despite the absence of government, one of the things is, I think also, and I think UN Habitat can help with this process, one of the basic things about slums is that bulldozing slums is not the answer. What we need to do is to actually do reclamation and visiting of slums where a first stage negotiation occurs with the people to work out how their part of the slum can be reclaimed and new infrastructure can be brought into it. So that kind of world brings the government into it because legislation becomes possible. From Sebastian, many authors argue about the unsustainable nature of cities themselves. If we cannot stop population or urbanization growth, what is the scenario for our planet under these circumstances? Will we last more than 200 or 500 years? Well, one of the things that's happening, and I think is in places like Europe, Australia, and parts, not all of North America, but parts of North America, where populations are now economically more stable, then people have been having less children. In fact, parts of the cities of Europe, and we have to remember, even though the cities of Latin America, Africa, and Asia are burgeoning, we're getting mega cities of more than 10 million people. In Europe in particular, but in parts of the United States, cities are getting smaller. And it's partly because of financial crisis in places like Detroit, but it's also in other cities, places like some of the European cities of Central Europe in particular, and I think Vienna would be an example, and some of the cities of Central Europe, which are the most sustainable cities at the moment, at least in places like the Netherlands, where Amsterdam is attempting, and Scandinavia, where there's major preoccupation with sustainability. Those cities are actually seeing declining population through declining birth rates. And so there is possibilities. No, if we kept on populating at the level we're currently populating the planet, currently at 7 billion people and moving very quickly towards 10, then the planet, just by virtue of the population explosion, will become unsustainable. But cities and the process of urbanization, particularly through talking about the ways in which urbanization brings denser cities with less resource use, could be an answer to that problem. We've reached 11 o'clock. We have a further question from Anna. How can we avoid creating more inequality between urban and rural settlements during the urbanization process? And how can we manage possible risks such as food shortage? Well, in effect, the current relationship between urban and rural settlements is completely skewed. At the moment, what we're seeing is the people are leaving the land and they're moving into rural districts. In the process that I described before, which I would describe as cluster city zoning, and then cluster settlements around cities with, again, restrictions on urban growth, that would lead to rural pockets of agricultural land being closer to cities and without the urban sprawl we're currently seeing. So instead of seeing mega cities sprawling to become 10 million people, what this proposal of clustered cities and clustered settlements with agricultural land between them suggests, and with fast transport between them suggests, is that you could actually build in which you densify the population, but you've still got agricultural land right into the center between the cities. And that could actually mean that we don't see that simply we create inequality between those rural settings, because we take food growing seriously and people can work on that food in a way that is actually giving them a livelihood in new ways. I think that there are organizations such as Via Campesina also, which is working with the world's agricultural poor, which means that land rights, particularly indigenous land rights, become important in this process. Now we're talking about this happening far beyond cities, up into the mountains and into areas which are beyond the discussion we have today. But that will entail governments dealing with the question, what is the relationship between the city and the rural districts, and what is the redistribution process that should occur? But I think this has brought us to the end of our discussion. It's brought us to the final part of our discussion. And so I thank you very much for the attention. I thank you for being part of this exciting event. Good night.